You're listening to the Backwards Hat CMO Podcast with Dave Daba, presented by Stealth.ltd.
Welcome to the Backwards Hat CMO Podcast. I am Dave Daba, coming to you live and, of course, on tape from the heart of the Silicon Valley. Now, joining me today on the big podcast, I have Jeff Greenfield, who is CEO of Provalytics. Jeff, I knew I was going to butcher that. It happened at the very beginning. I just want everybody to know that when you think of Jeff, I want you to think of the actual Cookie Monster. Now, Jeff, why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit of background on yourself, and why the hell would DeBaugh call you the Cookie Monster?
Well, you'd call me the Cookie Monster because I'm screaming about cookies as much as the Cookie Monster does, as often as he can get cookies. And what the Cookie Monster does, when you think about Sesame Street, is he eats up cookies. If the cookies show up, he's going to eat them. There's not going to be any cookies left when the Cookie Monster is around. And you're calling me the Cookie Monster because I'm the one who's screaming. I feel a little bit like Chicken Little because I'm screaming that the sky is falling. And it really is when it comes to tracking and measurement and planning, because cookies are on their way out. It's like they let loose the Cookie Monster all over the internet, and he's gobbling up every single cookie. And by Q3 of 2024, they're all going to be gone. I mean, that is third-party cookies, which is what the ad tech world lives off of.
Yeah, I think like the average sort of person out there is not aware of what this is actually going to mean for big brands and for marketers around the world. This is a fascinating topic. I'm super excited to have you here, Jeff. For those of you that know me, you can probably tell that I am pinch hitting a little sick today. One of the kids decided to work their way back from college, and in the first 15 minutes of being in the house, probably coughed at least 20 times. So I am on the what appears to be the backside of a cold now, which is a good thing. So 3 topics for today's podcast, and I'm going to go ahead and we're going to cover the cookie collapse. I wanted to talk a little bit with Jeff today about influencer impact. And I think both Jeff and I share a love of storytelling. So we've got 3 topics to cover. As always, these shows tend to last between 20 and 30 minutes in length. I want to thank everybody so much for tuning in. You know, Jeff, let's get into this whole cookie collapse. I had this cheesy line, which was, how are savvy marketers adjusting? But not all marketers, quite frankly, are savvy. So I think just in general, how do you think companies and brands are going to be adjusting to what's about to hit?
Oh, they're going to adjust, I'm going to say poorly, because most brands, especially the larger ones, it takes them a very long time to make a shift. And I haven't seen any of them prep for this yet. And since we're less than a year out for it, it means that their adjustment is going to be very poor. But I want to take a step back a little bit just for some of the listeners who maybe are a little lost on this. You know, cookies are kind of what run the whole universe, if you will, of the internet. A cookie is what allows you, when you go to type in Amazon.com on your computer and you're able to automatically log in, that's a first-party cookie. Same thing when you go to New York Times to read the news. They know who you are. So first-party cookies are cookies that are set by the site that you're on, and it allows them to read and write and add information and allow them to personalize the experience for you, which is great. Third-party cookies are cookies that, when you're on the New York Times, an advertiser can set a cookie or an ad server, so that when you're on the New York Times and you go to the Wall Street Journal, an advertiser knows, hey, you already saw ad number 1 and you've only seen it once today. Let's show it to you 2 or 3 more times. And then that's that limit, what they call frequency capping. I don't want to overexpose you. So they use third-party cookies to know how many times you've seen an ad, what ads you've seen. But on the measurement side, we use it to collect a bunch of information to be able to determine what's working and what's not working. And the internet's worked that way since the beginning. I mean, this is like a core component of browsers. I mean, if you had said to me 7, 8 years ago that they're going to get rid of cookies, I'd say you're crazy. They're not going to do it. It's core to the internet, but it's happening. And the reason it's happening is because of privacy. And it started a number of years ago with GDPR and the EU, where they essentially said, hey, you know, if you've got a list of names, you no longer have that list of names. Those names are no longer there. You now have to allow people to opt in. You can't go to people who you have a name of and tell them, hey, do you want to be on my list? No, you have to start from zero and build up. And so that made its way to the US, where we now have laws across multiple states where it says if you have a list, you need to allow people to obviously opt out, to say, remove my information, or to answer them if they say, hey, give me a data dump of everything you have on me. So that's why you can do that now on like Facebook and LinkedIn and things like that. And the issue we have right now is that every state kind of has its own version of it, and it gets very, very difficult. But Google, which is about 65% of all of the traffic goes through Google's Chrome browser, they've been saying for the last couple of years, we're going to get rid of third-party cookies, and it's going to be a shake to the industry. It was supposed to happen last year. And we should be cookieless right now, but they pushed it off because the industry started freaking out, said we're not ready for it. And so now it's finally kind of coming around. But cookies, third-party cookies have been gone from Firefox or Safari for a rather long time. Cookies haven't worked in mobile for a long time. So this should not come as a big shock, but it's going to be a huge shock. It really is.
It's you know, a couple things. One, if you go into the ritzy, fancy, way overpriced grocery store across the street from my house, you will still find a plethora of cookie selections. I just had to say that in reference to our whole Cookie Monster bit. But you know, as somebody that's been up in the Silicon Valley for 20 plus years now, I can tell you the glory of actually seeing your brand show up on ESPN, on CNN, on a bunch of different sites, following people around who had been to your brand in the past, was key for a lot of marketers, especially those in B2B, that understood sort of like one of the golden rules of brand development and brand engagement, which is, you know, they've got to see your brand at minimum at least 50 times before it has any sort of, you know, real recognition. I remember the first time I read IBM's first study on this particular topic, and it was like, oh, well, people have to see your brand 10 times. And like 2 years later, it was 25. And then it was 50. And the reality is, you know, we're north of 50 now. And if you are somebody like me that works with a lot of startups, you know, telling them and trying to show them how to get brand exposure, especially from a desktop sort of environment, because you're absolutely right about mobile. But from a desktop environment, has, you know, you've always been able to rely on that third-party cookie method. And now my job, as well as a lot of other people's jobs, is about to get significantly more difficult.
No, you're absolutely right, Dave. You know, and when you think about it, both from a B2C and a B2C marketplace, you have an infinite marketplace. You're going out there, and so you're just kind of shooting a shotgun out as much as possible. But in the B2B world, sometimes you have a very small, finite audience. And so one thing you have to be careful of is that if you overexpose that audience and do too much exposure, you can kind of burn some bridges as well too. So you have to be very cautious and careful about how you plan these things. And that's why measurement becomes so critical. And with third-party cookies, we were able to do amazing things. We could capture every single, and it became a big data thing. You capture every single click to your website, where the click came from. And then you also capture every single impression. And what I mean by that is that those ads on ESPN, they would have a tracker in there that would send back to kind of the mothership that said, hey, this user with this user ID saw this ad at exactly this time. And then even Facebook, there was trackers that were on Facebook, even Amazon. And so when the person would do some action on your website, like fill out a form, request a lead, download a white paper, using big data, we could go through and stitch together a path to conversion that included every single impression and every single click, and then do analysis on it to determine what was working, what wasn't working, what messaging was drawing people, what messaging was even making people pull away. Very powerful stuff. But now with third-party cookies going away and those trackers not being available and not working, all we have is clicks coming to our website. So now we're back to a world where it's essentially last click, which for a considered large purchase, something like a B2B, like a technology purchase, that's a tough thing, because this is a considered long-term sale process. You're dealing with accounts, so you're dealing with multiple people over a very long period of time. And so what we're living in now in this age of kind of what we call back to the future, if you will, because we're now back to how things were before the digital age. If you look at big brands back before digital, like BMW, like McDonald's, like in my area, Dunkin' Donuts. How did they grow these huge brands? Well, they would run ads on TV, radio, and print, and they would run a campaign, and they'd step back and do an analysis. And at the end of the year, they would do another analysis, and they would use this technique called marketing mix modeling, which is essentially panning the camera back at a macro level to see what was going on. And so with the digital world, we were down at this user level data. We were getting user level data, stitching it together, and trying to come up with conclusions. Well, since that data is no longer there, we're going to have to pan the camera back, but we're not limited to how things were in the days of marketing mix modeling because of machine learning. And now all of these advances with AI, we can take measurement, which we've used in the digital world for a number of years called attribution. We layer in this kind of AI-driven capabilities, and we can take aggregated data and push out very granular results, the type of results that you're used to seeing, Dave, the type of results that someone who's running like a search campaign, like campaign ad group, keyword match type, it will give them those level of recommendations so that they can keep doing things without losing a beat. And that's kind of where we're at these days. It's pretty amazing when you think about it, because it showed up just in the nick of time. It really did.
Yeah, use of attribution models and those things are going to become even more and more important, especially for companies in the B2B tech landscape. Just a couple quick things. One, I really appreciate anybody that comes on this particular podcast and says ESPN and mothership in the same sentence. That right there is huge for me. And then, of course, references one of the greatest movies of all time, Back to the Future. Jeff, you're definitely rocking. What do you think, like, the attribution influence is actually going to be on marketers? Like data warehousing. In the past, I would go into a company, maybe a more well-established company that had a bunch of data and just had no idea what to do with it. And so you'd have silos of data all over the place, and you'd have to sort of like figure out what to do with that. In today's world, or in the world that we're moving into, there are going to be certain aspects of that data that's no longer available to us. So how do you sort of see marketers dealing with all of this? What kind of strategies do you think they're going to have to implement to actually solve some of these problems?
So, I mean, first off, we've lived in this era for the last decade of the data-driven marketer. So you're 100% right, because the days of warehousing as much data as possible, what it's actually proven out is that it didn't actually make media more effective. In fact, all the research has shown is that as we've gotten down into the details, we've lost our perspective, and marketing has actually had to work harder, and which means ad effectiveness is cut. So one of the first things that marketers have to do is they need to make sure, because right now when you're buying media, especially for a larger brand or even a decent sized B2B brand, you're buying across multiple platforms, everything from LinkedIn to Facebook to Snap to maybe even TikTok. Maybe you're doing some trade desk buys, CTV. All brands, both B2C and B2B, should be utilizing and testing all these platforms. That's a lot of data to keep track of. And even though you can keep tabs open and keep going to check and see how your buy is progressing, you first need to warehouse all that data, and you need to look at a data aggregator. Companies like Funnel.io, Source Medium, these are companies that specialize where you go in and you click and they access the APIs, and they do a great job of aggregating the data and normalizing it. So as a marketer, you've got one place, one login where you've got all your data, and you can see an update every hour or every day of how much you've spent, how many impressions, how many clicks there's been across everything. But the other thing that's important to understand is that none of these platforms are talking to each other. Everyone is in a walled garden these days. Even Google, they're all completely separate. And the reason they do that is because by keeping stuff within their own universe, they can charge more, they can make more money. I mean, think about it. This is just the way they operate. It's smart business for them, but it's a real pain for the marketers. But the first thing is you have to aggregate all this data. The second thing is you need to start thinking about how are you going to model this data? Now, what I mean by that is that if you're buying media, and let's say you're across 5 different platforms, and you know you can afford to spend X to get a lead or to get something into your funnel, and you keep spending and that number stays the same, you're good. You don't need an attribution model. You just need to convince the CFO to spend more money. But eventually, every business, whether you're B2C or B2B, you're going to get to the point where your cost to acquire a customer is going to poke through a number that you're going to be uncomfortable with. And that's the point where you start to realize, well, maybe the way I'm looking at this is off. And that's where you start to need some very extensive modeling. Now, the first thing you need to think about is how are we going to model all this stuff? Because what ends up happening a lot of times is some things are clicks. Like in the last world, everything we looked at was through this lens of clicks. But now we have channels that we call no-click digital channels, like CTV. There's nothing for anyone to click on. Podcasts like this podcast. If there's ads in this podcast, there's nothing to click on. I'm on my iPhone. So how do you evaluate channels where there's nothing to click? Well, you have to evaluate impressions. So now you're in a whole new world where now instead of collecting Google click data and my display click data and LinkedIn click data, I actually want to be looking at data through the lens of impressions. And guess what? We're back to the future again. We're back in the world before digital, where we talked about how many GRPs, how many people do I need to reach in market in order for me to get my message out there? And that's the world that we're going to be living in moving forward, because you can always count the number of impressions. So the first thing is I need to aggregate this data all together. I should have one place to go. And that one place should hopefully have dashboards, or I can use Looker or Datorama or Tableau to build out dashboards. And then I need to start unifying all this data using impressions to start building out some models, because if my cost of acquisition is okay now, it's not going to be as you start to spend more. It's just not.
This sort of leads us into our final topic of storytelling. But what I wanted to mention just super quick is when you think about like LinkedIn, and my favorite way of describing LinkedIn these days is you get really passionate and you get deep and you go dark social. And you start really sort of, it's a dark social platform. It sounds so ominous. But at the end of the day, LinkedIn, for the most part, doesn't want to send you to YouTube, doesn't want to send you off to Spotify. It wants its viewers, its algorithm wants its viewers to stay in its LinkedIn stream, which means when you're actually producing content, and I'm talking about non-paid content here, and you're producing content for LinkedIn, you have to produce quality content that people who are going to view it are actually going to, believe it or not, I know this is so hard, but are actually going to benefit from it. And I think like this is something that gets so lost on so many brands. I don't care if you're a major CPG brand or if you're a small startup that's just posting your first couple of posts. It is amazing how many people and how many companies, quite frankly, don't get this right, which absolutely, as I'm coughing, thank you to the kids, but which absolutely takes us into our next topic, which is storytelling and how to actually win doing it. I'll pass that one over to you next.
Yeah, I mean, storytelling is the key to getting people engaging with your brand and making them passionate. If you think about it as a human being, the time that you watched a movie that evoked some sort of emotional response with you, I think one of the disservices that digital marketing as a whole has done to this entire generation of marketers, and I speak about folks in their 20s and 30s, is this belief that advertising's job is to have an immediate impact, and that the job of marketing is to sell right now. And Google is probably the biggest pusher behind that because of their whole click thing and getting people in that lower funnel. And now we have retail media as well, where I'm about to add a certain soap to my shopping cart on Walmart.com, and there's an ad for a competitor right there to push me out of the way. But really, the reason I'm buying a certain soap is probably because of ads that I saw when I was a teenager that kind of put messages into my brain. And there's this concept in advertising called advertising ad stock, which is that there's an immediate impact to advertising, but then there's this long-term lagged impact. And the more emotional connection that you make with people, the longer that ad stock impact is going to be. In fact, when you measure media and you look at the ad stock, sometimes the ad stock long-term is more than the immediate impact. And there's been tons and tons of research on this. There's a gentleman that I know very well who's done a lot of work with the ARF, and his technology has actually gone in and he can take any brand's television campaign and he looks at the emotional response of the ads, even digital, and just by changing the types of shows that they're in, they'll sell more stuff. And it's known that soda brands, when they advertise in comedies, their sales go up, and drama, their sales go down. So there's something to this. And for marketers who think that you have to hit people over the head multiple times with these TikTok style ads that don't have any story, if you step back, you'll start to see some of the larger brands, and again, I'm going back to the future, are starting to bring in storytelling that's more emotional because it sells better and it sells more long-term because of that ad stock. And if you Google advertising ad stock, you'll see there's a long article in Wikipedia, but take it in, it's a lot of math, but it lets you know that this stuff is for real. This is not BS, it's for real. And you can do a lot of selling more long-term than you can short-term.
So it's sort of like back in the day, the cigarette companies knew that if you could, hook kids young, you'd have them for a very long time. I mean, that's totally ominous. But the strategy, though, hasn't really changed so much for a lot of companies. They think about, what's going to drive immediate revenue. That's one thing. And then the second thing is, how do we build that long-term brand growth that we want to see? And so small little startups and companies in the B2B space aren't thinking like that. They're thinking, in the short term, they're not thinking about the long term. So if you're a company that's going to be around for a long time, and you have consumer goods products, I would immediately begin targeting, the Gen Zers and the millennials, and get them to have brand recognition. Forget about whether or not they buy anything. It's all about brand attention, and you want to bring that into the fold as soon as possible. One thing on the storytelling side that I think, assuming you've got your targeting done right, and you're targeting the right audience at the right time, which Jeff, a lot of people don't do, but let's just, for the sake of it, assume that you have that going. It's the non-creative, boring campaigns that don't stand out, that kill some of the storytelling that's going on underneath it. And it's amazing to me. You and I could probably write some great courses on copywriting. It's amazing to me how bad actually a lot of the digital ads are that I see, without naming names. Who you are. A lot of you out there are not doing the boring test, which is we know who we're targeting. Is this particular campaign or post going to actually give some real attention to the brand, or is it going to just run flat? Are you playing it safe as a marketer is really what I'm getting to.
Totally. One B2B campaign that stands out in my mind, Dave, is, and I heard this at an investor conference a number of years ago, NetSuite by Oracle. The CMO there did something absolutely amazing, which has always been a philosophy of mine. Most B2B brands, they say, we're B2B, we're not B2C. And so they run by the typical B2B playbook, but they forget that nights and weekends, the B2B buyer is a consumer. Yep. They're at home, they're watching TV, they're listening to the radio. And NetSuite started running ads on Sirius XM as a B2C brand, but they were advertising to B2B, and they absolutely positively killed it because they were targeting B2B. That was their messaging, but they were in a spot where no one else was. And the advantage for a lot of B2B brands is you're in a place that's not cluttered, and you're hitting people at a time when they're not expecting it. And that can sometimes cut through the boring aspect when you capture people's attention, because that's one of the number things is, hey, everyone likes a surprise.
Staying in the whole CRM space or SFA space as it once was. Long time ago, I was at a conference in Atlanta. Mark Benioff was there. He gets up and he, tells Tom Siebel and all of Siebel's disciples, how wrong they are with what they're doing. I was able to spend I was young. I was able to spend 5 minutes with Benioff after he basically pissed off 1,500 people in an auditorium. And, Salesforce was in the first couple years of its launch. And what I learned from them back then was exactly what you just said about NetSuite by Oracle, which is the Salesforce brand heavily marketed to consumers, knowing that the B2B world was really just an extension or a small facet of the larger consumer market, the consumer marketing place or organization. Like, it got to the point with Salesforce, depending on the airport you were in, but if you were in most of the major metropolitan airports and you were picking up your luggage, you were seeing a Salesforce ad rotating on there. Like, their point was, we're going to get to the market and we're going to try to get everybody in the world, originally in the United States, to recognize the Salesforce brand. And it's so funny. I mean, I'm literally watching F1 Cup the other night at an ungodly time. And it was like, I think it was their qualifying. So it was like 1 a.m. and the car's driving by the brand new, $1 billion+ sphere. And there, sure enough, is a Salesforce ad. And Salesforce has got a huge sponsorship with F1 Cup, which, what the hell does Salesforce have to do with F1 Cup?
That's right. Well, they want that audience. It's kind of the same reason why most major cities, I mean, how many Salesforce towers are there now? I mean, they're kind of following the same insurance company model, which is we're going to go in a big town like New York. We're going to put our name on the side of a building. We're going to be everywhere, is because every company here, large or small, should be a Salesforce customer. And it's super smart. They did that B2C plan because, as I said, at the end of the day, when I take off my work hat, I'm at home and I'm a consumer, but I'm still a buyer.
Yeah,
and that's important.
Well, Jeff, I think we're almost out of time. Like, people that know me know I can ramble on for hours, and I hate to do that to the audience. Any sort of parting words you'd like to throw out?
Well, what I'd like to throw out is that, the world is going to change in terms of the world of targeting and marketing and measurement. We've put together a certification course for attribution, because the way we did attribution before is completely changed. You can go to attributioncertified.com. It's a free certification course. You get a certificate for LinkedIn, but it'll give you more detail than what we talked about here, but will help you start to think about the plan of what you need to do as a marketer. And that's at attributioncertified.com.
Fantastic. And I'll make sure we include a link in the across all of the platforms that this will eventually find its way. Hey, one quick brand I think a lot of marketers should pay more attention to is Geico. You brought up insurance. If you just think about the entire insurance market, it has to be trustworthy, and there's certainly an aspect to that. But Geico, as well as a lot of the other insurance brands, have done a fantastic job finding a way to make their brands fun. And I think it's a very important thing that companies fail to recognize, that you can still have trustworthiness, but you can still have some fun as well. And I think what you'll find is far more brand recognition comes your way if you do that. All right. That is good old Jeff Greenfield over there from Provalytics. We'll include a link as well into his attribution training program. Sounds like a good thing for a lot of people to go out and take. For the Backwards Hat CMO, I got to start making the guests wear a backwards hat. For the Backwards Hat CMO podcast, I'm Dave DeBaugh, wishing you all a tremendous rest of your business week.
You've been listening to the Backwards Hat CMO podcast with Dave Daba, presented by Stealth.Ltd.